to think about human rights, it might help to think a little bit about rights and how do we understand what a right is. We all know what it is, but how do we define it? I'm going to use a definition from Nicholas Wolterstorff, the theologian whose work I'm drawing on today. He calls a right a legitimate claim or expectation about how we ought to be treated or not treated. So it's a legitimate claim or expectation, how we are entitled to be treated or not. And it's a claim that we make generally in relation to another specific person or entity. Very often, it's in relation to our government, as in this example of a police killing. Sometimes it may be in relation to another private individual, but it's in relation to some specific other. And so if this is a legitimate claim, it's fair to say that asserting your right is demanding something to which you're entitled. And I think that's the sense in which we're quite familiar with, knowing, if I have a right, we have a gut sense of what that means. Demanding that to which you're entitled. Now, what makes something a human right specifically? What makes something a human right specifically? One way it's been described is the common birthright of humanity. We can also think of a human right as simply those rights that belong to every member of the human family without exception. So by definition, if we're talking about a human right, it is available regardless of any particular status, like race, color, ethnicity, like gender or sexuality, like nationality, language, being housed, impoverished or not, whatever political affiliation we might have, it is available to all human beings without exception. So that's one important way to understand what we're talking about when we say human right. And Wolterstorff puts it this way: the only status one needs, the only condition required is that of being human. In other words, being a human is what gives one the right. We could also think about a number of characteristics that identify human rights in particular. We've already sort of gotten at the universality, the way in which these aren't conditioned upon a particular status, but applied to all people, which also tells us they're also available to us wherever we go. Human rights are understood to be, depending on your perspective, either inherent or divinely bestowed. So in secular or mainstream discourse, you'll hear language of inherent, and I'll talk about why a little later on. So there is a sense that one need not do anything to win or earn or gain human rights. We just have them. What is not determined kind of broadly within the pluralistic or secular discourse is what is underneath that, why we have them exactly or where they come from. Let me bracket that and say a little bit more about it later. But many of us coming from a faith perspective would think of human rights in some way as being divinely bestowed. And so kind of notice when you see that terminology and perhaps think about what terminology you want to use depending on who your audience is as you're advocating. Human rights are inalienable. We understand that they can't be extinguished or contracted away. Some can be reasonably limited for a proper purpose. So if one is found guilty of a crime, that will mean her liberty is curtailed. But there are some human rights that cannot or should not ever be impinged upon. For instance, the right to be free from torture, the right not to be enslaved. There are not boundaries around those rights. They're understood to be more absolute. Human rights are based on equal human dignity, based on a conception of the value, worth of the human person, and that being a sort of worth that warrants, that requires or demands certain standards of decent treatment. And if we all have this set of human rights, at the same time, on the other side of the equation, we all have responsibilities to respect the rights of others. And so we can see from that angle how rights are quite relational, and in that regard seem a fitting concern for communities of faith that are thinking deeply about relationships. Wolterstorff calls rights a normative social bond. So they have to do with how we ought to treat one another, how we should be able to expect to be treated by others, also by our government. And finally, and this is the legal piece, human rights today are protected under a special body of international law. And you had a link to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you got the email with kind of the pre-readings for this, if you didn't, don't worry, you can follow along, no problem. But just really briefly, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated shortly after the UN was formed, following the end of World War II, and a committee representing 18 countries worked to develop this document to synthesize and sort of encapsulate a set of human rights agreed upon by world nations. In that, this document was adopted by the UN General Assembly, and it's come to have a kind of singular moral and political influence globally and historically. It's known as the cornerstone of human rights law, and has gone on to influence the development of really all post-war constitutions formed since that time, and became the basis for many other legal instruments. So you saw, for instance, if you had a chance to look at the UDHR, you saw some of the rights listed here, and I've put a number of examples so you can get a sense, kind of a more concrete sense. When I'm saying human rights, there is this set of agreed upon rights in the Universal Declaration, and that's quite often what someone will mean. And there's great consensus on this sort of set of rights. And you saw it mentions the right to life under international law. I've talked already a little bit about that. Governments are obligated, including the United States government, obligated to respect, protect, and promote human rights, the rights that are here in the Universal Declaration. So because a government is obligated to protect the right to life, it must set out to control or limit circumstances in which lethal force is used, like the force used against George Floyd or Tyre Nichols. And that has been translated into more specific rules at the UN level about what that means. Means force must be proportionate and pursuant to a legitimate aim. And as I mentioned before, law enforcement is obligated to do everything possible to safeguard life, to use lethal force only when it's absolutely necessary. I mentioned earlier that one holds a right in relation to someone else. So to apply it to our example, George Floyd has a right to life. The state represented by Derek Chauvin, who as a police officer is an agent of the state. Chauvin has a duty to only use the force necessary, as I said. And I would summarize that by saying he has a duty of restraint. He has a duty of restraint in order to live up to the international legal principle to which the US and all other governments are obligated